Lesson 1, Part 3, a review of first and second declension nouns and an introduction to third declension nouns. Review. So far, we've seen the first and second declension with each of the genders, though there are no neuter first declensions. This is how we viewed them so far. So you can notice we've got some second declension masculine, second declension feminines, and second declension neuters. The second declension masculine and feminine are identical. The only way that we know that it's feminine is by memorizing them. The two most common ones are hadas and brought the other one off the top of my head. Hadas is the most common one. Then we've got the second declension neuter, with the only difference being the nominative and accusative have to match. So we've got an on up here, and then we've got the as over here. First declensions, we've got the three different forms for the feminine. Don't forget, if the stem does not end in epsilon, iota, or rho, then it cannot keep an alpha all the way through. So we got to have that switch going on over there. Difference between masculine and feminine shows up in the first two spots, the nominative singular and genitive singular. We have ace and then u instead of a and then ace, or a and then as. Same thing could happen if we've got alphas. We could have as, u, I, an in those positions there. Plurals are exactly identical to what the feminines have. Now, up until this point, we viewed the stem of, for example, logos as log. In actuality, the stem is laga. There are some unusual things that happen when certain endings are added. For example, in the singular dative, the omicron switched to an omega. So because of this, we learned the endings of the second masculine as as, u, o, an, oi, on, ois, us. Now you'll notice there's an omicron or an omega in there somewhere in each of those. That's because the omicron is actually part of the stem and the ending is something a little bit shorter, but that would have been far too difficult to introduce you to at the very beginning of Greek 1. So we simplified and said that these were the endings, when really these are the endings. Just a plain sigma, which that one's easy enough to see. Take off the omicron and you just get a plain sigma. But here, the ending technically is just an omicron. What happens is when we have the omicron at the ending and the omicron at the end of the stem come together, contraction happens. Now, again, we're not going to learn the actual rules of contraction until about lesson 9 or so. But for our purposes now, just know right here, when the omicron and the omicron came together, in English, that would pronounce oo. So to make an oo, we had to spell it this way in Greek. Omicron with an iota, for some reason, didn't become oi. It's what we would have expected, but the omicron lengthened to an omega, and so the iota subscripted. This one was normal. This one was normal. Here, the ending actually is own, so the omicron and the omega join together. This one was easy enough, just add it to the end. And then a lot of times news will do weird things when they're added to things. So here the new and the omicron made an oo is what actually happened there. But these are what the actual endings are. And really, they are what we're going to see for the most part in the third declension. These are sort of like the template that you start with, and then they get changed in some interesting ways. If you compare these also to the endings found in the first declension without the alpha or without the eta, you'll see that they're very similar as well. Now the sigma dropped out for the feminine, and the omicron did some weird things, which actually became a sigma. But then we had I or ain and on or I or a. On or ain, that's pretty normal. We have I, own, the alpha just dropped, ice, and as, the new dropped out. So it's fairly similar to what we're used to seeing. Now, these shortened endings are the endings we will need for the third declension. So introduction to the third declension. First and second declension nouns all have stems that end in a vowel. Omicron for the second declension and either alpha or eta for the first declension. That's why they follow those particular patterns, is because their stem ends with those letters. That's why they follow the first pattern or the first declension or the second pattern or the second declension. Remember, a declension is a group of words that all act similarly. There are three main groups. First, those whose stems end in alpha or eta. Second, those whose stems end in omicron. And third, those whose stems end in consonants. Third declension nouns have stems that end in consonants. So there's three different patterns that our nouns are going to follow. Now, within each of those patterns, for example, within first declension, we do have a few different patterns, but they're very, very similar. We've got masculines and we've got feminines. Gender is almost, in that case, almost like a sub declension inside our big declension. Now, it's not entirely because gender does all kinds of other stuff in the language, but as far as how to form our nouns, it's almost like a mini sub declension. And then within feminine, we've got three different patterns going on. For second declension, we've got masculine and feminine all look the same, and then we've got neuter looks slightly different. So we've got different patterns going on. That's how we have our different declensions. And you know which declension a word is in based on what does the stem end with. Now, for third declension nouns, since the stems end in consonants, when the endings get added, some unusual things are going to happen depending on what the different letter is. See, for second declension, they all did exactly the same thing because all of them, the stem ended in omicron. Now, weird things happen, but we sort of memorized them because all of the second declension nouns did the exact same weird things. Same for the alpha and the eta, even though those are two slightly different vowels, they're very similar. And so all of the words in the first declension had all of the same weird irregularities with the exception of the masculine. But because there are so many different consonants that can be at the end of the stem, there's tons of unusual different things that can happen when the endings get added. These unusual things follow good linguistic rules called morphophonemic roles. That means that when you add one morph or piece of a word to another, there may be a change in some of the letters. And if you've studied phonology, you'll know a little bit about that. If you haven't studied phonology, just know there are very good reasons for why all of this is happening. And if you go on further to study more, you may come back to this material later and go, oh, I see what's going on. But really, it's not necessarily going to help you to know why everything happens at this point. Just learn what does happen, and that'll serve you well enough. Because there are so many different kinds of changes that can happen, we are going to study each kind of third declension noun separately, so we don't throw them all in at once. Now, they all have the same endings or nearly the same endings, but there are a lot of little changes that can happen. You will not need to be able to decline these nouns. You don't have to list them out in their proper forms, but you will need to be able to parse them. And of course, you'll need to be able to translate them. So make sure that you are familiar enough with what is going on, that you can parse them properly and that you can translate them.